It was the night of April 14th, 1912, in the Atlantic Ocean. A ship considered impossible to sink was about to disappear beneath the waves, taking 1,500 souls with it. But what if I told you the Iceberg wasn't the only villain in this story? What if there were secrets aboard the Titanic that have remained hidden for over a century? Today, we're diving deep into the mysteries surrounding the world's most famous maritime disaster. Mysteries that might change everything you thought you knew. The RMS Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a floating palace that represented humanity's ultimate triumph over nature. Measuring 269 meters long and towering 53 meters high, it cost $7.5 million to build in 1912, equivalent to $400 million today. Inside, passengers walked through stained glass corridors, swam in heated pools, relaxed in Turkish baths, and dined in restaurants that rivaled the finest hotels in Europe. The company's vice president stood before the press and declared with absolute confidence, "This ship is unsinkable." But there's something the public didn't know. Before the Titanic even left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, a fire was already burning in one of its coal bunkers. This wasn't a small fire. It had been smoldering for 3 weeks, even before passengers boarded. The crew tried containing it, but the intense heat had already weakened the steel walls of the hull. Some researchers today believe this hidden fire compromised the exact spot where the iceberg would later strike. Was this disaster waiting to happen before the ship even set sail? The voyage began with 2,200 people aboard. Wealthy industrialists traveling first class, middle-class families in second class, and hundreds of immigrants in third class, all dreaming of new lives in America. In command was 62-year-old Captain Edward John Smith, the White Star Line's most senior captain. This was supposed to be his final voyage before retirement, a perfect ending to a legendary career. On April 12th, just 2 days into the journey, the first ice warnings arrived via radio. Ships in the North Atlantic regularly communicated about ice conditions, and the messages were clear. Massive icebergs lay ahead. Captain Smith received these warnings and altered course twice, but he made a fatal decision. He refused to slow down. The Titanic continued charging forward at 21.5 knots, roughly 40 kilometers per hour. Here's where it gets suspicious. Why would an experienced captain ignore ice warnings and maintain full speed? The answer might lie with a man named Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line. He was aboard the Titanic as a passenger, but witnesses reported he had been pressuring Captain Smith throughout the voyage. The company wanted to break the speed record for crossing the Atlantic. They wanted headlines celebrating the Titanic as not just the largest and most luxurious ship, but the fastest. At 2 p.m. on April 14th, when another ice warning arrived, Captain Smith showed it to Ismay. Instead of posting it for the crew to see, Ismay stuffed the paper into his pocket. The night of April 14th brought unusual conditions. There was no moon, creating pitch-black darkness across the ocean. The sea was unnaturally calm, so calm that there were no waves breaking against icebergs, which would normally create white foam visible from a distance. The lookouts in the crow's nest had another problem. Their binoculars were locked in a cabinet, and the officer who had the key had been reassigned before departure and taken the key with him. This wasn't discovered until after the disaster. At 11:39 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something ahead, a massive dark shape rising from the water. He rang the warning bell 3 times and grabbed the telephone. "Iceberg right ahead." The message reached First Officer William Murdoch, who immediately ordered the engine room to steer left and reverse engines. But at that speed, with that much mass, the Titanic needed nearly a half mile to turn. 37 seconds. That's all the time they had between spotting the iceberg and impact. At 11:40 p.m., the ship's starboard side scraped against an iceberg measuring 200 by 400 feet, as large as a football field, weighing an estimated 1.5 million tons. The collision lasted only 10 seconds, but it was enough. The ice tore a series of small openings along the hull, breaching 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments. Here's the cruel irony of Titanic's design. The ship had 2 revolutionary safety features that made everyone believe it was unsinkable. First, a double-bottom hull, 2 layers of steel at the base. Second, 16 watertight compartments that could be sealed off. Engineers calculated that even if 4 compartments flooded, the ship would stay afloat. But the iceberg's damage was lateral, rendering the double bottom useless. And 6 flooded compartments? The math was brutal and simple. Titanic would sink. Captain Smith and the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, inspected the damage. Andrews did quick calculations and delivered the horrifying verdict. The ship had perhaps 2 hours, maybe 3 at most. The unsinkable ship was doomed. At midnight, Captain Smith ordered distress signals sent. Senior radio operator Jack Phillips became the unsung hero, frantically transmitting SOS calls into the darkness. 20 minutes later, a ship called RMS Carpathia picked up the signal. Its captain immediately turned toward Titanic at maximum speed. But there was a problem. Carpathia was 107 kilometers away. Even at full speed, it would take 3.5 hours to arrive. But here's the mystery that still haunts historians. There was another ship much closer. The SS Californian was only 37 kilometers from Titanic, close enough that passengers on Titanic's deck could see its lights on the horizon. The Californian had stopped for the night due to ice danger and turned off its radio at 11:15 p.m. When Titanic began firing distress rockets into the sky, the Californian's crew actually saw them. They reported the rockets to their captain, Stanley Lord. His response? He insisted they weren't distress signals, just rich passengers celebrating with fireworks. Captain Lord went back to sleep. The next morning, when they turned the radio back on, they received the frantic SOS calls. By then, it was far too late. If the Californian had responded, it could have saved nearly everyone aboard the Titanic. To this day, Captain Lord's decision, or indecision, remains one of history's most controversial moments. Meanwhile, on the Titanic, crew members began loading lifeboats. Here's where another shocking fact emerges. The ship had only 20 lifeboats with capacity for approximately 1,200 people. But there were 2,200 aboard. Why so few lifeboats? The White Star Line believed they were unnecessary. After all, the ship was unsinkable. Besides, too many lifeboats would clutter the pristine first-class promenade decks. The first lifeboat launched with only 28 people, though it could hold 65. Why? Most passengers genuinely believed the ship couldn't sink. Many refused to board, thinking it was safer to stay on the massive ship than venture into a small boat in the freezing Atlantic night. But as water flooded the forward compartments, the bow began tilting downward. The rear lifted out of the water, exposing the massive propellers. Reality set in, and panic erupted. People fought for seats in the remaining lifeboats. First Officer Murdoch reportedly fired his gun into the air to control the crowds. Some witnesses claim he later shot himself, though this remains disputed. There's another mystery here that took decades to resolve. For years, survivors insisted the Titanic broke into 2 pieces before sinking. But official inquiries dismissed these claims, insisting the ship sank intact. It wasn't until Robert Ballard discovered the wreckage in September 1985, 3.8 kilometers beneath the ocean surface, that the truth emerged. The ship had indeed broken apart, with the 2 sections lying 600 meters apart on the ocean floor. At 2:20 a.m., the ship's structure could no longer bear the stress. With a deafening crack, Titanic split in 2. The bow section plunged first, followed minutes later by the stern. 1,500 people either drowned with the ship or died within minutes from hypothermia in water temperature of -2 degrees Celsius. Among those who perished was Captain Smith, who reportedly stayed at the wheel until the end. Also lost was the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, last seen staring at a painting in the first-class smoking room, having accepted his fate. Radio operator Jack Phillips, who'd sent distress calls until the very end, also went down with the ship. Joseph Bruce Ismay, the man who'd pressured the captain for speed and pocketed ice warnings. He survived by boarding one of the last lifeboats. He spent the rest of his life vilified as a coward. The Carpathia arrived around 3:30 a.m., rescuing 705 survivors from lifeboats. They searched for hours, but found only bodies floating in the freezing water. The disaster sparked immediate outrage and investigations. The British inquiry revealed catastrophic failures, ignored ice warnings, excessive speed, insufficient lifeboats, no safety drills. Captain Smith had actually canceled the drill scheduled for April 14th, calling it unnecessary. There was also the steersman's error. When ordered to turn left, Robert Hitchens panicked and initially turned right, directly toward the Iceberg, before correcting his mistake too late. These revelations changed maritime law forever. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was established to track icebergs and warn ships. The Solis Treaty established new safety standards, including mandatory lifeboat capacity for every passenger aboard. The Titanic's wreckage lay undiscovered for 73 years until Ballard's expedition found it. Today, bacteria and organisms are consuming the deteriorating metal. Scientists estimate the entire structure will completely disintegrate by 2030. The ship still fascinates us because it represents more than a maritime disaster. It's a story about human arrogance, our belief that we'd conquered nature, shattered in a single night. It's about class inequality, with third-class passengers locked below deck, while first class had priority access to lifeboats. It's about the invisible fire that may have sealed the ship's fate before it ever left port. And perhaps most haunting of all, it's about the ship that watched from 37 kilometers away and did nothing. 112 years later, we're still asking, could it all have been prevented? Subscribe to Hidden Latitude to uncover more mysteries. Thanks for watching.